My name is Lindsey Cook, and I am the representative for climate change at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva. I've been asked to talk to you today about my experiences and perspective on what part I see Quakers playing in creating a sustainable future, and also to ask, what is God calling us as Quakers to be and to do? I can share what I've come to understand, knowing that while each of us have a personal journey with God, we share a shared history and a presence as Quakers. I've come to see sustainability as a way of being, but also as a way of seeing the world around me. It's not always been like that. I was raised in the USA. I went to study in Britain. That's where I became a Quaker. Most of my early work was as humanitarian work in conflict zones. I never really thought about the environment until my 40s, and that's when I began to see climate change as a peace concern. And my first assignment when I went back to graduate school to study climate change was to read an essay by an economist named Kenneth Boulding. At the time, I didn't know he was a Quaker. I didn't know that his wife, Elsie, was a profound influence at the Quaker United Nations office in New York. I was reading this essay called A Spaceship Earth. And for the first time, I began to really visualize what it meant to live on the Earth in this galaxy, to be on a spaceship that is so precious, so beautiful, and to think somehow as we're living as if its natural resources were unlimited, which they're not, as if we can do these actions without affecting the climate, which we are affecting, that suddenly we were treating this beautiful spaceship and destroying it. Since then, the concept of who I am and what I do, and an even deeper sense of the consequence of how I live, has been something that I try to internalize, but also that I try to seek when I look at my decision makers and what they're offering in their policies. And it's not been a simple journey. And I'm always learning, and I'm often humbled. And I wish that I could, as I used to, point a finger at a dictator or a human rights abuser and say that this is what's wrong. But I began to realize that the human impact on Earth, the consequences of how we are living and the policies that we're taking are affecting the most vulnerable, they're affecting our children's future, they're affecting the children who are not yet born. And I realized that the finger was pointing at me. That was a very powerful moment. And I had to look in the mirror. And I had to do so and accept and take responsibility for who I am and how I live. But I wanted to do that because at the time I was living in Germany. And in Germany I began to come across something that I can only call intergenerational grief. I realized I lived in an area where there was this heaviness that young generations longed for a story of their parents and grandparents in World War II, a good story about what they did to oppose Hitler. And it wasn't there for almost all of them. And there was this grief, this sadness. And I thought, well, what is the legacy that I'm living? What is the moral challenge in my life? And what am I doing about it? And what is the story I'm going to leave my children? I began dragging our family of 4 into a more sustainable lifestyle. I became quite self-righteous until one day my youngest, 13 years old, was covering a piece of food on the table with a napkin, and I said, "Darling, that's not very normal to do." And she looked at me and she said, "What is normal in this family? We don't have a car. We don't have a dryer. We don't eat meat. You don't even eat dairy. We don't fly unless it comes to visiting grandma in America. I cycle to school in the ice and the snow. We buy vegetables from a farm. We don't go to the supermarket for vegetables. We get our heating from Greenpeace. We have solar panels, and we rent downstairs because you say the house is too big for one family." And I sat there and realized that what I thought was my sort of contribution could also be a burden for someone else in our family. So we sat down and talked through, how do we find the balance? And in some ways, I learned that that approach was what brought them together, and that they now feel a certain pride for how we try to live. The word judgment is something that I try to avoid, the way of being judging, because I realize that I will then judge myself, and I'm not perfect. And if we are all part of this brokenness, how can we all be part of this rebuilding, this transformation, this story of what we did when we knew? We Quakers have a history of identifying a moral call for conscience, often long before our family, our human family, sees it as such. And in history, although it's easy to look in hindsight to think that something was obviously wrong or immoral, at the time, questioning that activity usually caused and met with a lot of resistance. There are many examples in Quaker history of this, but one that I often use when I think of facing climate change is the abolition of slavery. Because at the time, slavery was the ground of the economy. People who were making the decisions in government were benefiting from slavery. And today, the main drivers of climate change, be it fossil fuels, be it deforestation, industrial agriculture, etc., they are very lucrative activities, and some people are making a lot of money off them, and many of those in government are involved in the policies that uphold them, and that our economic systems are driving these forward. Right now, with global temperature rise, land degradation, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, and species extinction, all of these environmental crises are happening at rates of speed faster than anything in our human history. Many of the activities causing one of these crises is also feeding another environmental crisis, and the time is limited. With climate change, the current greenhouse gas emissions, and they are increasing as we speak, are on track for a global mean temperature rise of what we say 4.8 Celsius by the year 2100, above pre-industrial levels. And that rate of rise is unthinkable. The level of profound loss of life, of nature, the collapse of our human civilization as we know it, and these are extremes that do not need to happen. They are avoidable. And I can say that with confidence because CUNO, under FWCC, is the only faith-based observer at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, called the IPCC, which gathers the latest climate science research worldwide and advises our governments. So how can we reach the hearts and minds and grasp this? That every half degree of warming makes a profound difference to saving lives, to saving species, to saving the ecosystems on which our human lives depend. And remarkably, it is still possible, with urgent action, to stabilize global temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. My work on climate change often involves interfaith events. And I've been moved to realize that the Quaker concept of personal witness alongside political action is not a given in communities. Yet for Quakers, we do both. We see both as essential. How we live is our witness to then engaging with our decision makers. If we are flying to the Caribbean, if we are living a life that is completely unsustainable in how we consume, then who are we to ask our governments to create policies that help create a sustainable future? We want to be the personal witness, but we also want to engage politically. Because as we know from the past, for example, Quakers could stop having slaves and stop owning slaves, but that didn't stop slavery. It needed laws, and it needed policies, and it needed us to engage. How can we understand what God is asking us today? For me, the answers lie in the Bible and in our Quaker testimonies. When I read the teachings of Jesus, I read the message of love, the message of forgiveness, the message of protecting the poorest and most vulnerable, and the warnings over greed. When I read the Quaker testimonies, I find the guidance, and I cannot underestimate how these teachings and these testimonies and guidance are relevant today in transforming the root causes driving climate change. Let me explain. Testimony 1, equality. Today, inequality, the gap between the richest and poorest, is ever growing. Quakers speak of the white-right relationship, and for decades have considered how an economic system can in turn feed the very destruction of the planet on which we depend. To share a statistic, quote, the global economy is almost 5 times the size it was half a century ago and has already been accompanied by the degradation of an estimated 60% of the world's ecosystems. Testimony 2, justice. Inequality feeds injustice. Those with the most unsustainable communities threaten the ability of the most vulnerable communities our youth, and all our future generations to live on this planet. Intergenerational justice is acting sufficiently now to ensure the health of our next generations. Let us uphold the justice. Testimony 3, peace. War is too often a political choice, and it is not inevitable. Countries rarely include in their greenhouse gas emissions calculations the emissions of their military, let alone the destruction and rebuilding required in a devastating war. Peace builds a future. And peace building, what is often at the core of Quaker messages, has a profound contribution to helping communities face the natural resource stress of climate instability or rising temperatures. And those peace-building approaches can help communities from avoiding more violent conflict. Testimony 4, truth and integrity. Speak truth to power, as we often hear Quakers say. But what does that mean for sustainability? Talk about what you see happening around you. Talk about the climate shifts. Talk about the loss of wildlife. Talk about the loss of birdsong, the dead rivers, the fields stripped to everything but one crop. Talk about it. Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenage activist, asks, is anybody listening? Denial, self-numbing, or what sometimes is called climate silence are some of the greatest mountains we need to climb. Testimony 5, simplicity, and some would add sustainability. In the past, we Quakers were always known for this. Our lives, our dress were considered extremely simple. And now we are more modern, more integrated, but Quakers inspire me to live ever more deeply in sustainability. Just when I think I've done much, a Quaker will remind me, often without words, that my journey has just begun. I will finish by returning to my personal journey. I'm learning to embrace my imperfection as part of my journey. I can work so hard to live sustainably, and then I fly across the ocean to visit my mother. I'm learning that forgiveness is part of touching the hearts of others, to join the human family to face these challenges. We are asked to love God with all our heart, our mind, and our soul, and to love our neighbor as ourself. But how can we love and forgive at a time when our very lifestyles and our economic systems and economic policies are fueling the destruction of God's creation and our neighbor? The word sustainability may seem small, but it is part of a personal witness linked to our political action, our faith, to be on this journey, however imperfect, that we leave a legacy, a story for our children and our unborn generations, that we acted when we could, that they, when facing challenges in their time, can and must act when they can. To act with love and forgiveness to our imperfection, and also forgiveness to those who are unable to grasp what is happening. Do not curse them, but help them. To reflect, and I will finish with George Fox's words. Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you are and wherever you come, that your courage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone, whereby in them you may be a blessing, and make the witness of God in them to bless you. Thank you.